everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Transformative Play Initiative's Traditional Tabletop Role-Playing Games Design Basics. This is the first part of a two-part series that goes over tabletop role-playing games. The second one is on indie role-playing games. So just a brief agenda for this lecture. We're going to cover what is a role-playing game, the emergence of tabletop role-playing games, how to use character sheets to analyze tabletop RPGs and why to do so, mechanics in Dungeons and Dragons, the cultural legacy of Dungeons and Dragons, traditional role-playing games and their design, game design in Call of Cthulhu, game design in World of Darkness games, mechanics in Vampire the Masquerade, and some takeaways. Now, obviously, we can't cover all of this in much depth, so this is going to be very much broad strokes, but we'll hopefully give you just some basic information that will help you relate to the material more deeply. So what is a role-playing game? Role-playing games are co-creative experiences where participants immerse into fictional characters and realities for a bounded period of time through emergent playfulness. And while fantasy, science fiction, and post-apocalyptic fiction are common, they can be any genre, setting, or theme. Although these are the themes we're probably going to focus on the most today. There are three main types of role-playing games. There's digital or virtual role-playing, there's tabletop, and there's live action role-playing, and we're focusing on tabletop. Tabletop is usually played sitting at a table, sometimes with dice and character sheets and miniatures. It is often less physical and more verbal. So, tabletop role-playing games, a very brief and selective history of design. The emergence of tabletop role-playing games. The first official tabletop role-playing game was Dungeons and Dragons in 1974, and it was written by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson. This game was heavily influenced by, among other things, Conan the Barbarian, which is the sword and sorcery fantasy genre that emphasizes heroism and violence. Also, The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien, where there's this fellowship or adventuring party, each with their own individual skills that ought to offer to the party. And then there's a war against hordes of racially and culturally othered monsters that are purely evil and must be destroyed. And we'll see this being repeated again in Dungeons and Dragons. So from these sources, the setting and the character of early Dungeons and Dragons arises, including adventuring parties with quests to complete. Each member has those individual skills and they're fighting against monstrous others often. They have a consistent battle sequence with many non-player characters that are killed by the party. And they're often in these genre settings that different from our current world in some key way, whether to a large degree or to a smaller degree. And this can include fantasy, horror, and post-apocalyptic fiction. So D&D was heavily influenced by also the game diplomacy. In diplomacy, players would negotiate with one another as representatives of countries, and this is a form of role-playing. It's also an early form of bleed, as players could deceive each other in order to gain advantage, which would sometimes upset other players. So there wasn't as clear of a boundary between player and character as in most games. Some people call diplomacy a friendship ruiner. And then there's the RAND Corporation and US government military simulations. So role-playing was taking place in the government in the mid-century to practice skills in possible crisis scenarios. And then there was also leisure wargaming. So these were games that featured battles with armies of miniatures, and players would roll dice for the outcomes of these battles. And wargaming is still quite big today with games like Warhammer 40K. So Gygax and Arneson were involved in all of these things. And from these roots, the game mechanics and the tactics of Dungeons and Dragons arise. So tactical decision-making as a group, characters' actions based on dice-based conflict resolution mechanics, and mathematical probabilities that are attached to skills. And these are called a character's stats or statistics. So Dungeons and Dragons is facilitated by a game master who describes events and officiates the actions. often via a dice-based resolution mechanic. The game master is responsible for the whole world, and players tend to just be responsible for their characters. So the game master has quite a bit of narrative responsibility and also must understand and be able to officiate the mechanics. Dungeons and Dragons involves players enacting specific characters in a collaborative adventuring party. They can explore maps, including dungeons and other fictional locations. They interact with other fictional characters in the world. They solve puzzles. They plan tactics, especially for battles. They enact violence upon other characters. They gather treasure, sometimes called loot, and they level up and become more powerful with experience. So I'd like to talk for a moment about why we use character sheets to analyze tabletop RPGs. So technically, a character sheet is considered a paratext, meaning it is usually external to the game, meaning that it's non-diegetic. Diegetic is a word that refers to what's happening in the fiction versus outside of it. So a character sheet isn't part of the fiction generally. However, character sheets are vitally important to the setting. They set many people's expectations of play. They emphasize what is important, quote unquote, about this game and what the player needs to know in order to engage with it. And they emphasize the verbs that players will likely enact in play. They often focus on what is called crunch, which refers to the mechanics, skills, abilities, and powers. And it often doesn't include or minimizes or makes optional what is called fluff, meaning descriptive aspects of the character and setting. So story-based elements often. Thus, we will be analyzing character sheets as well as some of the basic actions in certain tabletop games to illustrate the design philosophies and the affordances of these individual role-playing games, as well as the cultural legacy that they leave moving forward. So here is a character sheet that somebody has filled out from basic Dungeons and Dragons first edition. And so I'm going to point out some areas of the character sheet to hopefully give you a sense of how these aspects influence play. So you're given a class or a profession, and this determines your character specialties. In this case, the class is magic user. You're given ability statistics such as strength, intelligence, etc. And these offer mechanical advantages to actions relative to those scores. So if you look here, he has an 8 in strength and 11 in intelligence. So that will affect those die rolls, as we will see. You have protection statistics such as saving throws and armor class. These are mechanical advantages for protection of the physical body relative to the scores that are on the sheet. So you roll and then you'd compare to the scores on the sheet to see if you actually are able to protect against physical combat or magic. And then up here at the top, there is a small box for creative expression of the character. It says you can add a character sketch or a symbol, but this is definitely optional and doesn't affect play in any way. What's not pictured here is race. Race is a categorization for characters in Dungeons and Dragons, and it's actually a bit of a misnomer. What they really mean is species, but they don't use that language. So some examples of races in Dungeons and Dragons from the first edition are dwarf, elf, gnome, half-elf, halflings, half-orcs, and humans. So note that you can't play one of the quote-unquote evil races. So these would be things like the drow, elves, full orcs, and goblins. Mechanics in Dungeons and Dragons. So here's an example from second edition, or it should be third edition, to attack a foe. So this seems like a fairly straightforward thing. There are a lot of aspects that will affect whether or not you're able to succeed. I'm going to just go through the basics of this die roll. So first you would roll initiative, and that will help you figure out what the turn order is. If the monster goes before you do, then you may not get a chance to hit them, depending on how hard they hit you. So once the character is on their turn, Let's say the character has a strength of 8, like in the previous example, and the action has a difficulty of 10. The player would roll a 20-sided die called a 1d20, and you can see a picture of one here. And if the foe fails to dodge, then everything above a 2 in this case would be a success. A 20 means a critical hit that will, in this case, give bonus damage. A 1 is a critical failure, meaning it's a botched attempt, usually with consequences to the character, like maybe they actually injure themselves, or maybe they lose their turn, or maybe they fall down, making them prone to attack. The player in this case rolls a natural 20, as you can see on the die, meaning that they have a critical hit, which allows them to roll their damage dice twice. And that's a separate die roll, which we won't get into. So this is just the basic, a basic attack move. And then it becomes vastly more complex when you start adding multiple people and multiple actions. So the basics of casting a spell. This is from first edition. In this case, to cast magic missile, the character must be a magic user. So there are only special classes that can allow people to cast spells. The player will roll initiative for the turn order again, and on their turn, they will cast magic missile, which is a level 1 spell with a range of 15 feet. So the enemies must be within that 15 feet radius. The player will roll a 6-sided die, or a d6, as you can see here on the screen. And if the foe fails their saving throw, remember that magical protection, and they are in range, then the magic missile will deal 1d6 plus 1 damage to them. So you would roll a d6, and in this case, they roll a 1. Now, 1 isn't a failure here. It's only 1 point of damage. And you add an extra 1 to that, which gives you 2 damage. So in this case, they would roll 2 damage, and that would be deducted from the foe's total hit points. So at the core of Dungeons and Dragons, there are many large rule books with complex mechanics and setting information. And this can be a little bit intimidating to new players and to people who are more focused just on story. There's a lot of mechanics and battle tactics that are at the core of the game, as we talked about before, the crunch. Advancing the plot is often focused upon achieving certain benchmarks on a quest, usually through some form of violence and or looting. Sometimes the plot and encounters are pre-written in a published module, and other times people create their own, as we will see. The stories often feature smaller encounters, meaning violent encounters that lead to a final encounter with a boss. And additional aspects of story and character personality are often considered fluff, i.e. they are extraneous to the core of the game. Groups can play Dungeons and Dragons without role-playing their characters. I've been to games like that before where I was very surprised because I was used to role-playing my character, and instead people were doing what we call role-playing, R-O-L-L, meaning that they were speaking in the third person, they were moving miniature figures around on a dungeon map and rolling dice, but they weren't actually enacting their character. And just as a note, one very large community that is very focused on these especially early mechanics of Dungeons and Dragons is called OSR, which sometimes can refer to the old school Renaissance or old school revival. And this community likes to play in the old style, emphasizing potentially lethal combat. However, all of that being said, homebrew, as they call it, settings and mechanics are extremely common. In other words, people will adapt the game to the preferences of the game master and to the players in specific groups. So there's been countless of homebrew campaign settings that have been created since the inception of the game in 1974. There also have been extensive what we would call non-canonical paracosms or imaginary worlds, meaning there have been extensive worlds that people have created and enacted in their various gaming groups. So those have not necessarily made it into D&D rule books or setting guides, but they are very real within the community of play that they originated. And some groups will emphasize role-playing, story, and collaborative creativity in addition to combat. So I was part of a D&D campaign where we eventually, we started with a whole bunch of rules and eventually just ended up using straight role-playing for most of the experiences. So it really depends on the group and their preferences. So a little bit about the cultural legacy of Dungeons and Dragons. To date, it is still the most popular tabletop role-playing game of all time, and it is experiencing unprecedented popularity with 5th edition. This is due to the design of 5th edition, which is meant to cater to new players, at least more than other editions have done. Also, there is a huge accessibility of online play platforms, especially during the pandemic. So there was this huge surge of new players in the last few years. So an example of one of these online play platforms is Roll20. And here's some recent statistics. There was a 33% spike in D&D sales in 2020, adding to a 6-year growth spike, and it's still growing. So we're seeing this kind of 33% spike continuing to happen year to year. Additionally, Hasbro's press release notes that 80% had played the game virtually as of 2021. That means that for most of us who started playing Dungeons and Dragons, at least those of us of a certain age, we started in person. This is not necessarily the first experience that the majority of people are having, or even the only experience that they're having nowadays. And then Wizards of the Coast, which is the company that owns Dungeons and Dragons and is owned by Hasbro. So you'll see both of those names. It surpassed $1 billion in sales for the very first time in 2021. This is really significant considering Tactical Studies Rules, TSR, which was the first company that created Dungeons and Dragons, was selling almost nothing by 1990. So approximately $950 million in tabletop game sales. There's also been a surge of popularity of streaming actual play shows where groups will broadcast their D&D campaigns. Now, this is super interesting because, like I said, when I was growing up, the assumption was nobody would ever want to watch you role playing. So the fact that there's this huge market of people who are really enjoying just watching other people play is very significant. And those people then often become new players themselves because they see people having so much fun on these shows. So the most popular of which is called Critical Role, which started in 2015. Currently, at least according to this last April 2022, there were 1.6 million YouTube subscribers and 1.1 million Twitch followers, which is a streaming service. And then there was 9.6 million from Twitch payouts only for 2020 and 2021. So this is an extremely popular and lucrative way of engaging with Dungeons and Dragons. So the bottom line is that Dungeons and Dragons and its subsequent design and mechanics has and continues to be the first thing most people think about when they imagine a role-playing game. Unless their first experience is with online role-playing games, in which case they may have played a MUD or an MMORPG, which is also based in Dungeons and Dragons. So the consequences is that this is Dungeons and Dragons has been the subject of what we call moral panics around the world. There's this fear of players, quote unquote, losing touch with reality in the game or losing themselves in the characters. There was a book and a film called Mazes and Monsters in the early 80s, where Tom Cruise got his first big break as an actor, and not Tom Cruise, Tom Hanks. You get to see him lose touch with reality through playing Mazes and Monsters, which is clearly referring to Dungeons and Dragons. Famously, there was also a lot of fear of players engaging in the occult. And there was an evangelical minister named Chick, and he created these Christian Chick tracts in the 80s, where it would show people being lured into the occult through playing Dungeons and Dragons. And these were comic book strips. So they looked appealing to young people, but they were essentially Christian propaganda meant to deter people from playing role-playing games. Of course, oftentimes that will have the opposite effect and people might get super interested as a result. For an excellent and accurate dramatic reenactment of the Chick tracts, please watch Dark Dungeons. They actually got permission and they actually bought the rights to the Chick tracts, and they do a straight-laced reenactment of exactly what happens in Dark Dungeons. So essentially, Dungeons and Dragons establishes the default design and play settings for tabletop role-playing games, and indeed for video games, actually, because a lot of the early video games were also based in Dungeons and Dragons. So tabletop role-playing games, the traditional versions that are sort of from this legacy. Often actions are described in the third person around a table, i.e., my character does this or she does this, although sometimes they're enacted in the first person, saying, you know, I go and talk to the guard. There'll be character sheets, like I said, with scores for abilities, mechanics to represent combat and other skills, dice, other conflict resolution systems, which are often randomized. Now, this is important because there's this emphasis on fairness in these games. So somehow the dice make things more fair, and there's also this antagonistic relationship that gets set up between the GM and the players, at least in terms of you know, who they're fighting against in the fiction. So while anything can be attempted, the system encourages outcomes that are based on dice, which are directly tied to the success or failure of an action. Adventures and quests are often played out over the course of several game sessions, which are grouped as campaigns or chronicles. So it's expected that when you create these characters, unless they end up dying permanently, they will continue over the course of these several campaigns, or campaign sessions, I should say. Violence is a central component of the fictional enactment. There are also puzzles, problem solving, and strategy. And usually the group is part of a faction of characters that have collective goals. But they can also be individual characters that have specific abilities and limitations, and sometimes agendas that may or may not, you know, jive with the group. And then there's an emphasis on leveling over time, meaning that there are win conditions to this game and there are lose conditions to it. However, it's usually collaborative group play against the game master, like I said. So this is what we call player versus environment. Some people prefer to call it character versus environment. But the idea here is that the party is supposed to be working together towards a common goal, and the GM represents the opponent. However, intra-party conflict can occur depending on the choices of the players. And sometimes this will happen, for example, when people have different moral sort of beliefs or actions within the group that don't always mesh with one another, for example. Okay, so RPG design, I'm going to give you some other popular traditional role-playing games that we'll briefly look at. The first is Call of Cthulhu. This was designed by Sandy Peterson for Chaosium in 1981. It is based on H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos in the 1920s. The official book was based in the 1920s, although later books were in other settings as well. And it is part of the horror genre. So this isn't light fantasy. It's definitely more serious and focused on horror. While some characters may succeed in some action, engagements with the plot often cause characters to, quote unquote, lose sanity as they are exposed to vastly powerful, malevolent entities. So there's this emphasis on the inner fragile psychology of the characters rather than outward feats of heroism like we see in Dungeons and Dragons. Play focuses on investigating unusual occurrences. Combat is less common, and when it happens, it's often highly lethal. So players might want to try to avoid combat because they are quite vulnerable. Defeat is highly probable in Call of Cthulhu, and it's sometimes inevitable, meaning that these old dark gods are going to come back and take over the world and either convert or eat everyone in it. So it's sort of a descent game. while it does have statistics and conflict resolution mechanics, therefore win conditions, technically, characters are very underpowered and vulnerable, as I was mentioning. And unlike Dungeons and Dragons, players expect their characters to devolve into either quote unquote madness or death, sometimes even within the first game session. And winning is the new losing in Call of Cthulhu. This is an early example of a principle we call playing to lose, where players engage with the setting and enjoy the descent rather than the typical ascent structure of Dungeons and Dragons. And interestingly, Call of Cthulhu is currently the most popular role-playing game in Japan, meaning that Dungeons and Dragons is not, which is unique as far as I know. Okay. So some basic, what they call characteristic stats. We have some of the same ones from Dungeons and Dragons, strength and dexterity and whatnot. But there is also something called POW, which refers to one's personal magnetism, their spirit, and their mental stability. There's also a luck score, and then, as we mentioned, a sanity score, referring to the degree that characters can remain stoic in horrific situations. There are also specialized skills that focus on physical, but also intellectual investigation. So this is a game that where the characters spend a lot of time trying to figure things out rather than necessarily just breaking down the door and doing combat. So for example, you can see they have these investigation skills, like if you have a certain skill in archaeology, that might help you figure something out in a particular scene. There are also physical and psychological damage indicators. Again, the psychological elements of Call of Cthulhu are just as important as the physical, which makes it an internal game in a lot of ways, in ways that D&D is not usually. And characters can regain sanity by receiving psychoanalysis from another character, which is quite amusing for any of you who know the history of psychoanalysis, which became very big in the 1920s. This is a way for characters to help one another to, quote unquote, regain sanity. Now, it's worth mentioning that sanity is not always represented in a way in this game that people find, I don't want to say acceptable, but representative of the way people with mental illness actually experience the world. So it can devolve into stereotypes as a result of that. Then we have World of Darkness. Now, this was a huge shift, and I'm skipping over a lot of history here, but this was really important because this becomes, I would say, the second most popular game franchise next to Dungeons and Dragons. In the 1990s, these games came out. They were made by White Wolf, and they focused on flawed characters that were experiencing quote unquote personal horror. So this is similar a little bit to the Call of Cthulhu. And they're within this dangerous, corrupted world that resembles our own. So it feels very much like present day, whatever city you're in. But underneath it, there's this supernatural aspect that's being kept from most people. It's the second most popular tabletop RPG series with strong elements of social commentary, and it's in the gothic punk genre. It was based in the original design and throughout, in part on Jungian archetypes and the idea of shadow work. And we'll see, instead of clear-cut heroes, the characters represent some aspect of the monstrous. And so it's a way of taking these monstrous characteristics of humanity and externalizing them into these supernatural beings. But the inward journey is very much emphasized, at least in the books, and we'll go into that. So in Vampire the Masquerade, the characters struggle to maintain humanity while feasting as an immortal parasite and navigating Machiavellian politics. In Werewolf the Apocalypse, they struggle to try to preserve the soul of the earth from corruption while managing their all-consuming rage within them, which sometimes will erupt. And in Mage the Ascension, the struggle to avoid megalomania they can actually warp reality with their minds, and destruction is present while bending reality to one's will. These are just some examples. There are many World of Darkness games. The World of Darkness also has factions that often view other factions as inferior, more dangerous, or more quote unquote monstrous. And that means that it's easier to do violence against them or to machinate against them. Tabletop play tends to focus on a group deciding to ally with each other and work towards a common goal, despite any factional or interpersonal differences they might have. And in Vampire, these groups are called coteries. In Werewolf, they're called packs. And in Mage, they're called cabals, etc. Generally, the tabletop version of Vampire is player versus environment, although there can be some interpersonal intrigue within the party that can occur. And the emphasis is on narrative in the game design. The game master is called the quote unquote storyteller, and campaigns are called chronicles. So the emphasis in the design of these games is to emphasize that internal battle between the human and the monstrous. And these are given mechanical scores, as we will see. And those mechanical scores have an influence over how much control players have over their characters, meaning that the storyteller can take over your character, similar to Call of Cthulhu, if you fail one of these roles or lose control to a certain degree. So while the source books have many pages of evocative art, lyrics, instructions on how to create a tragic story of personal horror, they also feature hundreds of pages of social, mechanical, and combat mechanics. So there are leveling mechanics, and those are central in chronicle play. And this is an evidence of D&D's enduring legacy, even in a game that is trying to do something a little bit different. Players do not always emphasize this internal personal horror storytelling theme. Instead, sometimes they focus on attaining and exerting power externally. So for example, in Vampire the Masquerade, this tendency has led some critics to label the game superheroes with fangs, meaning that there isn't this emphasis on the internal, but rather on the powers that these characters can attain. Despite these critiques, it remains hugely popular with new editions and dozens of source books, an evolving metaplot storyline that is constantly changing, video games, television shows, and LARP offshoots, which have been very popular. And we'll talk about that in later videos on LARP design. All right, so here is the Vampire the Masquerade character sheet. And if you look up at the top, players can choose archetypes for their character behavior. So they will have an outward demeanor and they will have an inward nature. So there's the person that they show to the world and then who they really are. And oftentimes they'll choose a character concept that they're working with as well. So this is a lot more story-driven than what we see in Dungeons and Dragons for the most part. They have attributes like charisma, manipulation, and appearance. And those figure heavily in World of Darkness social role play. So while there is combat, there's also a strong emphasis on social interactions. Each vampire is granted supernatural abilities called disciplines, and these become extremely important to the way that the characters interact with the world. Abilities are organized under talents, skills, and knowledges. So you'll see that there's a wide range of them here. Some of them will be familiar and some of them are quite new. But the important thing here is that in order to, as we'll see, do a move, one generally will take something from the attribute category and something from the abilities category, add the scores up together, and then roll that amount of dice. So it's a large amount of dice that are getting rolled in Vampire. And I'll show you the way that works in a second. So the inner struggle between humanity and the beast is represented numerically on the character sheet. And remember, character sheets tell you how to play the game. So that should be a central focus for play. Also, there's a whole section for virtues, which can determine the degree to which vampires can maintain self-control. There's also willpower points that can be spent in order to maintain self-control or resist something from happening. Players can also choose character flaws, and these give extra points during character creation. So they can be quite popular to take. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that the characters are role-playing these flaws, or players are role-playing these flaws. Okay, so here's an example in Vampire the Masquerade of a social mechanic, in this case, intimidating somebody. So again, they will roll initiative, figure out who goes when, and on their turn, the character has a charisma of 4 in this case, and let's say an intimidation score of 2. So taking from that top category and the bottom middle category. In this case, the action will have a difficulty of 6, which is the default difficulty in World of Darkness. And the player will roll their charisma plus their intimidation. In this case, 4 plus 2 equals 6. So they will roll 6 10-sided dice, or D10s. And here is an example photo of what that would look like if a character were to roll all of those dice. Everything above a 6 is a success. 10 is a critical hit, again, meaning that characters can actually roll those dice again for potential and additional successes. A 1 is still a critical failure, meaning a botched attempt, and usually this has consequences to the character. In this case, botches will actually cancel out successes since you have so many die. So in this case, a player rolls a 10, a 4, a 6, and a 7. And since the difficulty is 6, that means they have 4 successes, which means they're probably quite intimidating in this particular situation. Here's an example of the use of a discipline. We talked about those supernatural abilities. In this case, entrancing someone to feel devoted to them and to want to please their character via the use of the discipline presence. So on their turn, the character, let's say the character has an appearance of 3 and an empathy of 1. The action has a difficulty in this case that is equal to the target's willpower. So let's say that the character that they're trying to entrance has a willpower of 5. So notice how this is a little bit different than the previous example. Players will roll their appearance plus empathy, which in this case would be a 3 plus 1, which would give us 4 10-sided dice, 4d10. The target can spend willpower points to resist this attempt if desired, if they are available. But let's say that they don't. 10s can be re-rolled, 1s are botches, just as we described before. The successes that they get affect the length of time that the character is entranced for this particular skill. If they have no successes or if they botch, it can make the target actually immune to entrancement by the character for a certain period of time. So in this case, the player rolls a 1, a 5, a 4, and a 1, which because the difficulty is 5, it gives them 1 success, but 2 botches for a total of 1 botch. In this case, the storyteller decides what negative consequences occur in the fiction. The target player will be immune for the rest of the chronicle to entrancement by this particular person, but there might also be other negative consequences that occur as a result of this botch. And that's where the storyteller's creativity comes in. All right, so we've gone over 3 important games in tabletop, and I just want to leave you with some takeaways. Traditional tabletop role-playing design focuses on combat mechanics and on tactics. It often has elaborate rule sets, modules, and lore that span many books. It sometimes focuses on win-lose conditions, although it may be designed to encourage playing to lose, such as in Cthulhu and in Vampire the Masquerade. And these games are hugely influential, especially on the structure of virtual games. I mentioned single-player RPGs as well as MMORPGs. There are also MUDs and MOOs and mushes, which were textual-based online worlds, still very popular out there in the internet. A lot of these are based in a Dungeons and Dragons model. And these games, particularly Dungeons and Dragons, are experiencing an unprecedented surge in popularity worldwide. So they're actually becoming quite culturally significant, even more than maybe they ever were before. So here are just a few of my citations. And I'm Sarah Lynne Bowman from the Transformative Play Initiative at the Department of Game Design at Uppsala University. If you're interested, please stay tuned for the next video, which will go over indie tabletop design. Thank you.